Excellent. So hi everyone, and yeah, welcome everyone online as well. Yes, I'm Kelly Widdicks. I'm in the School of Computing and Communications, and my talk today is on the climate impact of ICT. So this is research that I did with my colleagues Bran, Gordon and Adrian in the School of Computing, but also in collaboration with Mike Berners-Lee, Small World Consulting, and Charlotte Freitag that worked at Small World there too. So this research is very interdisciplinary, which should be quite exciting. Okay, so before I kind of go into a little bit more depth, I just wanted to start off with kind of what is ICT, so information communication technology, because actually this causes quite a lot of discussion in our kind of area. So when I talk about ICT, I'm thinking, the little devices that we have in our pockets and mobile phones, tablets, laptops, etc. But also things like games consoles and television, smart TVs, and the technology that kind of sits behind all this. So data centers and networks, and also technologies like artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, and blockchain. So this kind of all underpins our society, and this is what we class kind of as ICT in this talk. So ICT can kind of have, has a life cycle in which it can create different emissions. And the first part is these embodied emissions. So through the actual creation of the technology itself, through the extraction of the raw materials. And then we have the use phase emissions for ICT. So actually using that technology and maintaining it. And then the emissions associated with its end of life. So the actual disposing of that technology. So we wanted to kind of look into detail about what ICT's climate impacts are overall, kind of considering this life cycle. Is this a click as well? Yeah, that's great. So just to give some really brief methodology, and this is probably the boring bit, but this work was all based on literature searches that we did on the area of ICT. And we were particularly looking into how we, what kind of assumptions that people make when actually estimating ICT's environmental impacts. And we found that there are kind of three key analysts in the field that look at the entire ICT's carbon footprint. These are Anders Andre, Jens Modin, and Lofty Velkier. So we conducted kind of supplementary interviews with those analysts as well to kind of go into detail about their assumptions. And finally, we used research done by Small World Consulting on carbon accounting too. So where are we? So when we actually looked into this research, we found that there are quite limited studies on the environmental footprint of ICT. And those that do estimate it don't actually come to a consensus. So for the kind of main analysts that have done this work, they predict that ICT's global carbon emissions, or some global greenhouse gas emissions, are somewhere between 1.8 and 2.8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So quite a lot of disparity between these analysts. And these estimates actually vary because of the different data that people use to base these carbon estimates on, and also due to the recency of the data that they use, and due to the decisions that they make around what classes as ICT or what carbon emissions to consider. So going back to that idea of what ICT is, some of these analysts consider kind of take into account things like televisions, and some of them don't. Some of them might consider blockchain or etc. as not to be ICT. And also they don't always consider the kind of the full scopes of carbon emissions as well. So scope 1, 2, and 3. So there's lots of variation into what they take into account for carbon accounting for ICT. And when we looked into detail about the studies that were conducted currently, we found that these actually underestimate the environmental footprint of ICT because of these different data sources and the different decisions that they take, but also due to this thing called truncation error, where the full supply chain emissions for ICT and its full life cycle aren't taken into account. So we actually thought that the ICT's global greenhouse gas emissions are somewhere between 2.1 and 3.9%, which is comparable to the aviation industry. The analysts also didn't really take into account kind of activities and behaviours in society too. So kind of the what innovators do when they create new innovative devices, but also behaviors in terms of intensive device use. So that's the current environmental impacts for ICT, but what about the future? So actually, when you look into the future environmental impacts and what they project, is that they all differ even more. So these analysts do not agree in this kind of what the future environmental impacts are for ICT. And when you look into detail about this, they all differ because of these 6 kind of assumptions, which are sometimes but not always made explicit. So I'm not going to go into detail for all of these, but just kind of focus on 3 key ones around ICT's efficiencies, whether it's enabling carbon savings in other sectors, and also with renewable energy, decarbonize ICT. So will efficiency gains reduce ICT's overall carbon footprint? So on the one hand, the great thing is that ICT has continuously increased in efficiency, and some believe that, you know, despite global compute instances rising massively for things like data centers, we've still made some kind of huge carbon savings because of efficiency. But on the other hand, if you look at historically in that data, whilst efficiencies have continuously increased, carbon emissions for ICT have also grown hand in hand. And so the demand for ICT has actually grown and outpaced these efficiencies. And this is what we describe down as a rebound effect that's known in the area, which is basically when ICT's introduction or efficiencies actually lead to an increase in emissions. So we think that these rebound effects are actually causing these efficiency gains to be kind of overridden in that sense. Second one is about whether ICT is enabling carbon savings in other industries. So on the one hand, there's lots of arguments out there that ICT can reduce emissions from other sectors by up to 20%, for example, through the food and transport industry. And actually, a really good thing about ICT in the industry is that it's paving the way for the use of renewable energy. So it's really trying to shift in the investment for that. But again, if you look at the data historically, global emissions have continued to increase, with alongside ICT's growth in emissions as well. And what we actually think is that, again, these rebound effects are happening kind of at a global scale too. So kind of, if I go back to this bit, an example of how people think that ICT could reduce emissions in other sectors is through kind of video conferencing technologies. So through being able to speak to someone online and not having those emissions associated with the flights. But actually, if you look again at that data, flights have increased hugely. So the emissions with flights have increased, and video streaming and the traffic associated with that has increased as well. So these types of things are happening alongside each other. ICT is not substituting things like flying. And then finally, will renewable energy decarbonize ICT? So there are some estimates out there that renewable energy will reduce ICT's footprint by up to 80%. As I mentioned, there's a kind of push to renewables in that sense as well. But there are kind of limitations around renewable energy. So there's limited resources required for things like solar panels, like limited silver. So and there's also kind of embodied footprints associated with the kind of creation of renewable energy as well, or the resources for that. And also, if we put kind of all our renewable energy for ICT, then we're reducing other sectors' ability to decarbonize. So ICT cannot just expand without kind of no consequences in that sense. Okay, so whatever kind of position the analysts that we looked at take in terms of the future footprint of ICT, they all agree that ICT's emissions will not decrease without broad political and industrial action. In fact, kind of like the most optimistic projection actually sees ICT's emissions just staying stable. And if they did stay stable, then we'd end up with a graph like what's shown on the slide here. So what this graph is depicting is carbon emissions from now until 2050. And that blue section is the emissions for every other, well, globally. And the orange section there is the ICT's global greenhouse gas emissions. And if ICT's emissions stay stable whilst the rest of the sectors decrease in line with the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees warming, then ICT's share of emissions would form more than a third of our global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's just in the kind of best case scenario where they just stay stable. And we actually think that there are 3 reasons to believe that ICT's environmental impacts will increase. Firstly, because of the fact that ICT efficiency gains have coincided with emissions in the ICT sector and in globally generally. The analysts that we looked at all kind of admit key growth trends in ICT, such as artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, or blockchain, which have a kind of growing carbon impact. And there's significant investment actually in uptaking these growth trends as a way to green society as well. So we kind of highlight in this work that it's risky to assume that ICT by default will kind of help us with the achievement of carbon targets. There is some good news. I'm really kind of sad about all this work, but there's some good news that there are some ICT-wide climate targets being set. But we actually need net zero emissions and fewer aiming for this. There's also a focus on renewable energy, which I've just kind of described some of the issues around just focusing on renewables. But there's also a focus on carbon offsets, and there's issues around carbon offsetting. I won't go into detail today, but about making sure that carbon offsets are truly additional, so actually removing the carbon that people have put into the atmosphere. And then there's also net zero target initiatives set out by the International Telecommunications Union, and this has been approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative, but this is voluntary currently. So kind of key takeaways, ICT is being seen as a way to green the economy. However, ICT has an environmental footprint too, and this could be as much as comparable to the aviation industry. Moving forward, we need transparent evidence on what ICT's environmental impacts are, and making sure that all ICT organisations are taking a kind of consistent approach to considering this in terms of the scope and what's classed as an ICT, and being transparent about this so that we can actually scrutinise it, independently. And urgent action is needed across the ICT sector. So what I said before about the analysts all saying that we need broad political and industrial action, we need to take this in order to make sure that ICT's emissions align with the Paris Agreement. So this is kind of leads into a new research project that we've got in SEC. So myself, Gordon and Bran with colleagues at Oxford University, King's College London and Sussex and Small World Consulting as well. And we're trying to develop design principles that allow the sustainable and responsible innovation of ICT. So kind of bringing these ideas of rebound effects and whether ICT will actually reduce emissions in other sectors to the forefront when actually designing technology in itself. So yeah, that's our new project, and always excited to collaborate with people if anyone's interested. And yeah, thank you very much for listening to this talk. There's probably race through that, but yeah, there's more detail in the paper, and I'm happy to open up to questions as well.